Hi, everyone. My name is Megan DeBrain-Millay, and I'm really excited to welcome you to this roundtable on representations of contagious bodies in contemporary culture. And we hope that, like us, you are also excited about this chance to have an open, stimulating, interdisciplinary conversation. And while we know that this is a serious and very urgent topic, we also want to ensure that this is an opportunity for solidarity, support, perhaps even play. We'll see how the afternoon goes. Most of you are probably aware from the event page that this roundtable is associated with a book, Embodying Contagion, which I have right here, which is an edited collection of essays that was published with University of Wales Press just a couple of months ago. And it's available in open access thanks to a grant from the Dutch Research Council. We'll pop a link into the chat just in case you missed the one on Eventbrite. This event was organized by me and my co-editors of the collection, Sandra Becker and Sarah Polak. And we did this in conversation with our wonderful respondents, Priscilla Wald, who wrote the book's preface and whose own book on contagion narratives was really foundational for us during the editorial process, and Rosie Crocker, who has written the first review of Embodying Contagion for the Dark Arts Journal. And also here to talk with us today are some of the contributors to the book who you will meet now. So I'm going to pass the baton to my amazing colleague, Sandra Becker, to lead the next part of our talk today.
Okay, welcome everyone. Also from my side, thanks for the lovely introduction, Megan, and for showing the book. I tried, but unfortunately I have a very ugly background and I couldn't change it, so mine was blurred. I will now moderate the self-presentation of the different participants and contributors to the edited collection, Embodying Contagion, that have joined us today. Basically, exemplarily, I will start with myself. My name is Sandra Becker. I'm a lecturer in media and culture studies at Utrecht University, and I have functioned as one of the editors of the book. My pronouns are she, her, and for the book, I contributed the epilogue, which reflects on patterns in contagion narratives that have resurfaced at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic and are addressed in the different contributions. But I also contributed a chapter on white cis masculinity, fatherhood, and science in Guillermo del Toro's apocalyptic TV series, The Strain, from 2015 to 2017. Yeah, that should already be enough about me. I would now like to ask the other contributors and my co-editors to shortly introduce themselves, what they do, and their respective chapter topic. And I thought we just do this alphabetically, more or less. So I would ask Astrid Haas to start introducing yourself, if you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready. it's the kind of the curse of the first name beginning with A. So because usually I think alphabetically, then I'm with H. Anyway, so my name is Astrid Haas. I'm very happy to be here. So thanks to the organizers of this event for organizing it. Also to you, all of you who are editing, and of course my fellow contributors. I am a Marie Curie Fellow at the Institute for Black Atlantic Research at the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. And also my pronouns are she and her. And my contribution is also towards the end of the book. It's called This Long Disease, My Life, AIDS Activism and Contagious Bodies in Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart and The Destiny of Me. So I'm looking at two theater plays that deal with how bodies and identities are configured during the AIDS pandemic.
Yes, great. Thanks, Astrid. So as you have maybe noticed by now, I went for alphabetic order more or less by first names. So next I would ask Ilana Gommel to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, even though I had to get up very early to be here. So even though I'm in California now, as you can see from my background, I'm actually a professor at Tel Aviv University, Israel. And my chapter in the book is dedicated to the whole notion of how perception of time and history is inflected and impacted by pandemics. I wrote this chapter before COVID started, most of it in any rate, and I have to say that my own experience of pandemic time has only confirmed what I wrote in this chapter. When time becomes kind of gluey and gooey, and just this notion of eternal present in which we're all stuck, not moving anywhere, and the apocalypse, the final apocalypse, is eternally postponed. So I addressed the whole range of texts, which I won't name right now, but this is basically my idea and my research, and I'm still doing research in this direction. So I want to thank Megan for inviting me to participate in this collection, because it really contributed significantly to what I'm doing now. And I forgot to say that my pronouns are she and her. I really think it's really important to state, our preferred pronouns. So thank you all again, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilana. Also would love to hear more on your reflections now on your chapter regarding that the pandemic has happened. Moving on then to the next person, I would ask Frances to introduce yourself.
Hello, yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for having me, and for including me in the book, really, and especially to Sandra, Megan and Sarah for being very generous and supportive editors throughout the whole of this process, which was a bit of a slog for me. I was quite ill during writing this chapter, and so yeah, which seemed fitting, really. Yeah, so I'm I should say, yeah, my pronouns are they, them. Yeah, happy International Non-Binary Awareness Day. So yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Westminster in London, and my research is kind of always about fat bodies. And so my chapter in this book is about sort of fat bodies as contagious or contaminating within discourses that link in various ways the obesity epidemic and climate change, which seems like a bit of a niche and weird, and people are like, do those things go together? But yeah, there is quite a lot of kind of medical, quasi-scientific discourse around this issue. And so I'm interested in why and how is it possible for that to become kind of intelligible. Yeah, so it's a lot of me trying not to be too sarcastic about various terrible iterations of this kind of link, and the title is Fatties Cause Global Warming, which was actually a real Sun headline. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thanks for introducing yourself. There was just a comment also in the chat that it sounds like a really interesting read, and I can also say I really enjoyed it when reading it through the process of editing the book in several versions. So thank you very much, Frances. Then Micah Hilson, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Micah Hilson. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the chair of the English and Communications program at the American University of Armenia. My chapter really has two parts. In the first part, I kind of look at the popularity of zombie plague narratives and try and speculate on some of the reasons for why they're so popular. Part of my argument is that it's all about the kind of sense of control that a lot of the spectators have, a kind of identification with the survivors of the zombie plague. And that they're actually comforting because the kind of zombie plague can be gamified, that the zombie is very predictable in a way that real threats and real risks actually aren't in our like capitalist society. And so I kind of tie this to neoliberal ideology in certain ways in the first half of the chapter, and then there's a second half. I look at some narratives that really resist these tendencies. And the narratives I look at are lesser known stories by gay erotic fiction writers who show their protagonists, kind of trying to manage risk and feeling like they're kind of smarter, and feeling like they're this very capable kind of risk manager mentality, and then failing horribly. And so then I speculate on why these gay male writers might have kind of a different perspective on risk and the kind of eroticism of risk.
Yeah, thanks, Micah, for introducing yourself. Also a really good read. So Sarah just shared the open access link also in the chat. So if you're interested to have a look afterwards or during the session to come up with questions for particular contributors, then please do so. Last but not least, I would now like to ask my co-editors to introduce themselves. So Megan, would you mind going next?
Yeah, of course. So I am Megan DeBrain-Mollet, and my pronouns are she, her. I lecture in digital media at the University of Southampton in the UK. And my research in general really tends to be about how otherness gets absorbed and appropriated and remixed in mainstream popular culture. And that's also what my chapter in the book does. So I look at how the zombie is rehabilitated in this time of kind of always on convergence culture and crisis. I look at examples like TV shows like Santa Clarita Diet, iZombie, books like Breathers, A Zombie's Lament, or Warm Bodies, which was also adapted into a film. And I look at how the zombie as a figure of otherness is kind of embraced and ethically managed under capitalism and consumerism and neoliberalism. Instead of being a mindless character, becomes what I kind of call a mindful consumer. So they're aware of their urges, they're able to kind of ethically manage them for better or for worse.
Okay, thanks, Megan. I should also mention maybe that you have written the introduction together with Sarah, who I would now ask to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Megan and I have written the introduction, and I've written a chapter on basically Donald Trump's tweets about the Ebola scare. So this was in 2014, well before he was US president. And interestingly, around the same time, the American Center for Disease Control came up with a kind of prevention campaign or readiness campaign around a zombie apocalypse. And so in a sense, this is a kind of science fiction graphic novel that in many ways kind of both endorsed at the time in a kind of strange way Trump's kind of identifying Ebola sufferers with zombies, and also foreshadowing in some ways, like I say with hindsight, kind of the current pandemic time without the actual zombies, of course. And I wanted to say also that so my parents, I only see my mom actually, Yoshi Golf here, who and my dad, they're both here. They've really carefully copy edited the book. So all of the millions of alphabetization and notes issues that we were dealing with in editing all of your chapters, any mistakes made with that, it's their fault. Just wanted to say that. No, thanks. I want to thank my mom always, but especially in this context.
Yes, thanks, Sarah, for also mentioning that. And last but not least, I would like to ask our two respondents to shortly introduce themselves. We have the honor today to have the amazing Priscilla Wald with us, author of Contagious, Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak narrative. As Megan already said earlier, it was one of the inspirational works for this collection. And she also has written the preface to Embodying Contagion. And we're also very glad to have Rosalind Crocker with us today, who wrote the first review for the collection of the collection for the Dark Arts Journal. But basically, I'm now repeating Megan, so I'll stop talking here and I'll invite you to introduce yourselves and also to take over the moderation as respondents.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Megan and Sandra and Sarah, for inviting me. I don't think I have anything else to add to my introduction, so unless Priscilla, you do, maybe we should start with a few questions.
I just want to add my thanks. I was really honored to be part of this really terrific volume, which I loved reading in its original drafts and catching up on subsequently. It was really fun to see it evolve. Just, I don't list my pronouns because I feel I like pronouns to be user's choice. I'll answer to anything as long as I'm clear I'm the one being addressed. So thank you for including me. I guess I should say I'm a professor at Duke University and coming to you from Durham, North Carolina. So Rosie, go ahead.
Thank you. So I think I'll just kind of get started with my first question, which was just kind of the first thing that sort of jumped out at me when I was reading the book, which I loved, by the way. If anyone hasn't read my review, I just really enjoyed it. But I know I kind of came to contagion studies in the last sort of year and a half or so. That's what really has sparked my interest. And as I know, this book kind of preceded what has happened. I really wanted to know whether there are any kind of pandemics or just events or even TV shows or books that have really kind of inspired you to start looking into contagion studies. So if anyone has any kind of initial thoughts on that, feel free to jump in.
How should we do this? Raise hands? I feel like Sarah definitely would be the person to start on this question, but I could also say something about it as preferred.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm, well, like, first of all, of course, I started doing this research about the Ebola scare on Twitter before Donald Trump. You know, he was already a big player in that kind of online hype anyway, and in other media, but he wasn't yet presidential candidate. So that I was kind of already taken over by the facts even before the pandemic. And I think that as for my chapter, in some ways, I think my chapter is actually about like Ebola as something that has always been kind of like an essential part of the contagion narrative from a US perspective, was that was other, that was there, that was in Africa and concerned Black people, and who were therefore like in a kind of racist way easier to identify with zombies, and there was sort of a risk. You know, this is all kind of the discourse of this Ebola scare on Twitter. There was a risk that they might be coming to the US in order to spread the disease. And of course, one thing that we've really seen is you know, Donald Trump kind of picking that up as president in the context of the coronavirus, right? The China virus, and the way that he really initially kind of tried to stress the otherness of that. And then when he himself contracted the virus, it became sort of part of his Superman credentials, that he got over it quickly, even though, of course, he got treatment that was available to no one else. So I think that's it. For me, I thought it was really interesting to see the kind of difference between a pandemic that is a threat from the outside on the one hand, and a pandemic that is among us, and that we have to kind of embrace on a level. So I would have liked to include more of that in my chapter, but too late.
That's really interesting, thank you. Megan, did you want to jump in next?
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned, Priscilla Wald's book was quite influential for us. We were also looking at a lot, as we were deciding kind of how to pitch the book and where to place the book, and just how to talk to each other about contagion, because there are so many different ways that you can approach this, especially from this kind of cultural studies perspective. One of the things we kind of set out to do was, wherever possible, avoid this kind of two cultures discourse. And there's a book by James Peacock, and I'm just trying to find the full title from our proposals. But there's a lot of work that's been done, and I'll put the book in the chat just now. There's a lot of work that's been done kind of from a fantastical perspective, so contagion narrative, or a sociological perspective, so contagion reality. And we were really interested in what would happen if we tried to put these two discussions together. So that was in play. We also took a lot of inspiration from people writing about biopolitics, so Neil Ahuja, for instance, or about disability studies. So Margaret Shildrick was another influence that we kind of bring into the introduction. We're happy to share a kind of a bibliography if that would be of interest to anyone in the chat. But yeah, influences came from lots of different places. And it was largely kind of a matter of figuring out how to make those different discourses fit together and speak to each other in useful ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a broad topic, isn't it, the more you think about it? So that was something I was really impressed by in the collection, just the kind of breadth of what was being discussed. Have any of the other contributors got any thoughts on what really inspired their interest in contagion?
If I may, so I was actually I came to contagion via studies of the apocalypse, because I have been doing work on apocalyptic narratives. I'm a narratologist basically, so I was always interested in the apocalypse because it's such a well-defined narrative structure, right? Tribulations, whatever, and then you have the millennium. But contagion, which is one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, defies this narrative structure because it never ends. And this is what, and even before, COVID, it was very clear, because things like the plague always come back. And one of my inspirations was Camus' The Plague, but it ends with the rats coming back, right? So what happens when you have an apocalypse that never ends? And I actually wrote like very long ago an article about this never-ending apocalypse in relation specifically to pandemics, when pandemics were mostly like in a kind of science fiction books, which I always like to read because it's interesting, because it always happens somewhere else and to somebody else until it happened to us. And I was kind of pleased to see that it really is the way I described it, only more so. In the sense, it's never ending, right? Now we have the Delta variant, and we have Delta Plus, and God knows what. So yes, we have, vaccine, and we have, but it keeps coming back, and we're living in this state of perpetual crisis. And people have written about it, about crisis capitalism, and about the perception of time. It's not an apocalypse. It's a never-ending apocalypse. It's a present that never transforms into the future. So this was my where I came into this contagion studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. That was such an interesting answer. Astrid, I noticed you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. My chapter deals with theatrical responses to HIV and AIDS in the 1980s and 90s. And it actually grew out of my first monograph, which I published 10 years ago. And of course, I took a copy here. I can put it in the chat later. It's called Stages of Agency, the Contributions of American Drama to the AIDS Discourses. And for this volume, Embodying Contagion, I revised some of what I looked at. Also from the perspective of looking at the figure of the monster, because I was really more interested now in looking at how the bodies and identities are constructed. But really my interest started in the late 1990s in the topic of how people are perceived in the context of HIV and AIDS, when I watched a performance of Tony Kushner's play Angels in America when I was an exchange student in the United States. And then I wrote my dissertation. That's sort of my monograph, is the resulting revised version of the dissertation. I wrote it about American AIDS drama, how it changed the perception, what different functions plays took on as actually actors in the political scene, especially in the 80s, when the government was basically not telling people the truth about HIV and AIDS, even when they knew it. And so that is sort of like my interest in political theater then led me into that field, which I still find interesting, in the medical humanities. How do we look from a cultural or literary studies perspective? So that's my field, American literature. How do we look at diseases? How do we perceive people whom we consider at risk or whom we consider to be the carriers of disease or the diseased persons? How that is then from somebody who is ill for some time then connected to people's identities, their personalities, sexualities, whatever applies. So that is sort of my background, how I came to that collection. And maybe we should also mention that this started out actually from a panel at the American Comparative Literature Association's conference in Utrecht in 2017, where some of us presented as part of that, and then we thought, okay, why not enlarge that and make a book out of that, which I think was also an interesting point to see how so many different presentations and now chapters fit together. And I really like that as well.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, so the kind of interdisciplinary connections there are just fascinating. Micah or Sandra or Francis, have you got any further kind of thoughts on that question?
Shall I go first? Yeah, I mean, talking about the interdisciplinariness of this, yeah, I'm excited. This is my first foray into horror studies, as the book is. It's like quite a stretch from, I mean, I'm not really a sociologist, but sort of that's where I've ended up. But yeah, I mean, my sort of entry into this is from, yeah, just, you know, being a fat person in the world, and that moment in, I think it was 2017, oh no, 2017 even, no, what am I saying, 2007, that's what I mean, when the Foresight report came out, and these headlines about you know, obesity being a bigger threat as climate change were headline news, and I was just like, wow, that's some real dehumanizing stuff going on there, like on top of, you know, what was already going on at the time. And I think the mid 2000s are a real kind of high point of the obesity epidemic. So yeah, it was just, you know, and that I wrote something around that time, which is one of the first things I ever published, and it was good to kind of revisit that after another sort of 13 years or something of the development of these discourses, and to see how they had not gone away, sadly, and actually sort of dug themselves in deeper. So yeah, I'm really also, like a lot of other people here, interested in the kind of apocalyptic vision that often accompanies discussions of obesity, and the kind of, yeah, really overblown stuff at times, which I'm sort of drawn to in a morbid sort of way, and I've done quite a lot of work about how that it's sort of queering fatness and positioning it as a kind of societal death drive. So I'm quite into, that's my sort of take on this sort of tenor of obesity discourse. But yeah, there you go, that's my origin story.
Thank you. Yeah, just really interesting to hear about kind of how this discourse has changed even in the recent history. I've got another question about that later. So Michael or Sandra, did you want to just briefly say?
Well, I guess just really briefly, you know, part of my interest in, particularly what I talk about in my chapter, comes from things I did in my dissertation. I did a dissertation that looked at the history of gay erotic fiction from the era of pulp paperbacks to today, when, you know, most of it is being published by amateurs on the internet. And that kind of narrative, I mean, it sort of goes back to what Elena's talking about with narrative, that that kind of narrative of virality is one that works especially well with the online fiction, because there's a kind of discursive circuit between readers and writers, where the readers will comment, and, you know, basically their main comment will be more. I want more of this. Not exactly the same story that you wrote, but, you know, pretty close to what you wrote. And you know, that kind of narrative of a viral contagion spread is a way of course, giving the reader, you know, a kind of limited variation on the same thing. And, you know, sort of like, you know, the same thing happens to, you know, the person who catches this, and then they spread it, and then the same thing happens to the next person, except with those, you know, little kinds of variations in narrative. So, you know, that's part of what interested me in looking at that in my dissertation, and I've tried to expand that in a kind of larger, because I'm interested in the kinds of larger questions about what this kind of erotic fiction is saying about masculinity, what it's saying about culture, what it's saying about the relationship of people to like capitalism. And so I try and get into some of those questions as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just again, amazing how many different things kind of come together when you start to think about contagion. Sandra, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, sure. Basically, now we have come full terms with all the keywords that I already had in mind. Apocalypse, dissertation, masculinity, also climate crisis. So basically, my chapter, my contribution to the book was written on the side from my dissertation, which focuses on white masculinity and fatherhood in early 2000s US American TV series. And so I was already working on an apocalyptic show, the long-running AMC show, The Walking Dead. And then in the context also of the conference and talking to Sarah, I thought, like, why not also take the spin on a slightly different apocalyptic series? So I chose to look at The Strain, which tells the story of a mysterious vampiric virus outbreak in New York City and spreading from there around the world. And it is also focused on a white father protagonist, as many of the other series I look at. In this case, it is the CDC medical doctor and father, Dr. Ephraim Goodweather. And in my chapter, I've then argued that the aim by Del Toro to gothicize the inspirational work, Richard Matheson's famous novel, I Am Legend, in The Strain, together with this narrative dynamic, which values Goodweather's role as a father, basically over his role as a scientist, creates an anti-intellectual message in the series that reflects on the cultural climate in the United States before the election of Donald J. Trump. And later on then, when we were confronted last year with the COVID-19 pandemic, it was also very striking then to hear Trump vehemently rejecting to wear a face mask, even though the pandemic was really like on the rise, and instead called the virus an evil, invisible enemy. So there's this long process coming from apocalyptic fictions and gender dynamics in apocalyptic fictions to the specific virus outbreak story, and how fantasy is also used to explain certain pandemics or also issues such as the climate crisis.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Thanks, everyone.
If I could just add one strange reminder, strange especially in the middle of a pandemic, that contagion is also a really positive thing in a lot of contexts. Laughter is contagious, and our good emotions and ideas are contagious, as well as our, quote, dangerous ones. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about contagion, is that it's just so fundamental to being human, and human actions, human emotions, our connections to each other, that it's really kind of an analog for being human. And it's you know, remembering that in the context of a pandemic is very different from remembering that in some other context. But I think, you know, it's really important that it is, as Elena said, it's something that's ongoing, and it can be apocalyptic, but it can also be really salutary.
Definitely.
I just feel like I should jump in there and add that while this is in the horror studies series, we do also have this chapter by Angela Smith, who sadly couldn't be here at the roundtable today, but talks about affectionate epidemics, or kind of how affection goes viral on social media.
And related to that, there is of course the whole, a whole in marketing communication and so on, like endless shelves of books about how to make things go viral, how to kind of set off those kinds of reactions. And I think that's quite relevant actually to Angela Smith's chapter as well, the sort of like appeals for likes and so on social media. So I think that's another not only positive side to it, but I think it's true that it's far more fundamental. Contagion is far more fundamental than just pertaining to disease.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. And as you said, Priscilla, I think thinking about contagion this year is definitely more likely to give us a more kind of negative inflection on the term. I actually had another question to put to everyone, if that's okay to kind of jump in with that next. So I've pulled out a quote from Megan and Sarah's introduction. I just kind of wanted to sort of think about it a little bit further in the context of everyone's chapters. But the quote is, "In today's always in crisis culture, outbreak is our shared mode of discourse." And I know we've just been talking about kind of positive contagion, but I also think we're quite familiar with it as a term for sort of the spreading of dangerous ideologies or kind of, political movements and political sentiment. I just wondered if anyone had any kind of thoughts on how the discourse around contagion in sort of politics or society, like social movements, has been employed more or differently in the last kind of 5 or 10 years in this kind of always in crisis culture, whether that's something that has changed in the kind of recent history. So I wondered if anyone has any kind of strong feelings about that to start us off. Or maybe Francis, I know kind of earlier on we were kind of talking a little bit about how this discussion has changed from your perspective in the last sort of 10 years. Have you got any kind of initial thoughts on that question?
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question. There's, I mean, in the sort of the kind of fat studies field that I'm in, and the sort of decisive moment is that moment at which obesity becomes termed an epidemic, which is that, which turns it into a crisis, and, it entrenches the kind of medicalization of it. But yeah, I'm thinking about that there have been shifts, and I think one of them is the kind of acknowledgement at a very, what I would consider quite a shallow level of by sort of medical anti-obesity type people of a more kind of fat activist or fat acceptance type of discourse, and it's producing this weird kind of kind of, it's like the sort of post-feminism of obesity, this sort of watered down, using those ideas against in the way that weren't kind of intended to be used, which you can see in the other thing that I talk about in my chapter is this thing from 2019 that the Lancet produced, which is a kind of meant to be a more sort of considered take on this link between obesity and climate change, which they consider to be a syndemic. And it has this kind of veneer of kindness towards fat people, but still ultimately wants their eradication, basically. So yeah, I don't know, that's a sort of, it's a different kind of thing than I think you're talking about, but it is, I'm interested in the way these discourses kind of get taken up and shift over time, and do they really change in this case? I don't think so, but yeah, it's quite a specific thing in terms of what I'm talking about that might not translate elsewhere. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Has anyone else got any kind of thoughts on that initial question?
I mean, I know Priscilla wrote the book on this, in many ways. And Sandra definitely did a lot of research for this in writing the conclusion to kind of, when we had to kind of at the last minute decide how to address the current pandemic, because we had submitted the full manuscript before the first lockdown in kind of January of last year. But I think it's been interesting editing the book, just because there are so many terms that are used in it, like contagion or the zombie, or these sorts of things that have just kind of exploded in popular culture, and they've become so mainstream and they're used in so many different ways that it's actually really hard to get people to kind of pin them down specifically within specific contexts, which is one of the really useful things the chapters in this book I think have been able to do, is point out that actually contagion isn't universal and it isn't the same for everyone, and it has a long history, but it's worked kind of really differently in some of these different very specific situations. And kind of going back to what Priscilla was saying, I think it's been interesting as well that virality and contagion had kind of taken on such a positive color in popular culture up to the point of this pandemic, and now people kind of catch themselves using this language and thinking, oh, maybe I should rephrase, maybe I can't say gone viral anymore, or maybe I shouldn't talk about, someone having a contagious personality or contagious laugh, because it's become a little too real for me. As someone working on popular culture and kind of mainstreaming monsters, that was also really interesting, because the zombie pops up in lots of different ways as an example across the book. But those are all really different, and the zombie as a figure has also become a really meaningless symbol in lots of ways. It kind of means everything and it means nothing at the same time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. And we're talking about kind of two recent histories, aren't we? There's the recent history, which is the kind of like last 10 years, and then there's the very recent history of COVID. Has anyone else got any kind of further thoughts on the...
Yeah, I just did want to point out that, and I'm sure that, or I'd be interested to know whether you've also noticed this, but I think that there's been this sort of massive rise in demand for books and series and movies and whatnot about pandemics and about kind of outbreaks, and I think it's really kind of confirmed a lot of what the book also says about outbreak narratives, or the importance of an outbreak narrative. And people, I remember especially sort of in spring last year, there was this sort of demand for, and I also had the journalists calling me to ask, you study epidemic, you've studied epidemics, how is this going to continue? The sort of the idea that fiction is a kind of laboratory in which we can play out scenarios that are happening or haven't yet happened, I think is something that has kind of gained a lot of popular credibility, in a sense, that I think everybody probably in this room already knew. So I thought that was something that struck me, and also that gave me a pleasant kind of told you so feeling.
Just as a fiction writer, I have to agree with what you said, because I'm also a fiction writer, and like in the last year, I saw this incredible explosion. People edited anthologies. There were special issues of various, science fiction, fantasy, and I'm talking about science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And I would expect it to be just the opposite, like who wants to read about pandemics when you are sitting in lockdown, but people do. And I wrote my own pandemic story in which the pandemic was positive, okay? So it's an interesting phenomenon, and I wouldn't have been able to foresee it or predict it. I would have thought, in the real pandemic would be reading something else entirely. But no, there is a real pandemic narratives are going viral, so to speak. And there seems to be no abating of this hunger for new pandemic narratives. And I'm planning to do some research whether those pandemic narratives are different in their structure or approach to pandemics from older pandemic narratives, say in the late 20th century or early 2000s. It seems that there is some kind of shift, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. But yeah, pandemic is incredibly popular, and this popularity is not going anywhere.
Yes, and I think as somebody who was trained also as a historian, I'm always intrigued by this desire to find like historical parallels, to see sort of like, are there any things we have in common? So there's a lot of that, especially because it's now a bit more than just 100 years later, all these articles, all this research into the 1918, 1919 so-called Spanish flu epidemic, which also then hit Europe at a point of crisis. And I think that's sort of like a human desire to kind of like have a blueprint of how to act today. I mean, one of the interesting things is Sarah mentioned that the Centers for Disease Control in the US had sort of like a manual for how to act in a zombie apocalypse, but it seems that no Western country at least had any kind of idea of how to prepare for this type of pandemic that we're living through. So I think that sort of like the situation of crisis, we are not prepared. Can we learn anything from a similar situation, even though it's a different disease from the past? So that's something that I found intriguing, especially triggered now by the COVID-19 pandemic.
One question, excuse me, one question I have for everybody is it builds on the questions Rosie's been asking. Having been through this, if you were to start this process again and write an article for this volume again, what do you think might change in the way you approached your subject? Would it be the same subject with a different approach? Would it be exactly the same essay? Or would you write a really different essay? What has changed, in other words, as we are in the process of living through what we've all been writing about? Micah, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess one of the things I thought about. I mean, I did have a little bit of a time to add, maybe a few sentences in my essay post-COVID, but I didn't have a time to really reflect or really change it radically. I think that probably what I would get into a little bit more is just some of the kind of abstinence-only rhetoric of the COVID era. Because that's been very striking to me. I mean, we're sort of talking, we were talking a bit ago about how it sort of seems like we don't learn stuff from the histories of pandemics that have come before, that there's a lot from the 1918, 1919 pandemic that we could have learned, but didn't. And, some of the same things from the AIDS crisis, I think that we could have learned, but then seem to have forgotten. So some of the things about how an abstinence-only rhetoric really isn't very effective. And so to tell people, no, you need to cut off all kinds of desires for contact because contact, causes contagion, is maybe not the best kind of discourse. And I mean, in a lot of the erotic stories I'm looking at, that's exactly what they're dealing with, right? Is that kind of pull of knowing that contact might lead to contagion, but then still knowing that contact is part of what you need to feel fully human in the first place. And so when I think about some of that, the shelter-in-place rhetoric and the ways in which, of course, it privileges people who are in monogamous couples and doesn't really leave a lot of space for people who have lives outside of that, then this is certainly part of what I've been thinking about for the past 18 months.
Great. Astrid, go ahead.
Yes, maybe because it's kind of similar related. I mean, our chapters have some things in common. I think if I had written it today, I mean, in the way that in what I wrote, I also added a few sentences about like certain parallels, especially looking for scapegoats. So with COVID, it was at the beginning, like the Chinese flu or Chinese disease rhetoric. Also, that sometimes even like healthcare workers have been sort of like seen as contagious and avoided. So that's something a parallel also to the AIDS crisis. I think I would have like tried to look at first of all whether there's any theater play that deals with COVID, and even if that is not the case, look at also certain images that they have in common. So in many early AIDS plays, you have scenes where somebody visits a patient dressed in full medical scrubs, similar to what you wear for really having to wear for being in contact with a COVID patient, even though with regard to somebody who's suffering from AIDS, the patient is actually more in danger of from your germs than the other way around. But this kind of scare, this kind of like what images are being produced, this kind of metaphors, shifting blame. Also with AIDS, you have some similar things at work. Or with COVID, if you think about these different variants, now we use the Greek alphabet, but before we had these attributed these to countries. And for instance, the Alpha variant was then in the European press was called the variant detected in England. And in the English press, it was the variant first detected in Kent. I don't know what the Kentish press would write about it, but it's really kind of like, you try to get it out of your own backyard. And that reminded me of the early discourses about syphilis in the late 15th, early 16th century, where the French called it the Neapolitan disease, the Germans and the English called it the French pox, the Polish called it the German disease, and the Turkish called it the Christian disease. So we have these mechanisms at work, especially if there's any kind of stigma attached to a disease, which is less the case with COVID. But I think I would have tried to look at which types of mechanisms are still at work or coming up again, which are not, because we're dealing with very different phenomena. So I think that might have been something, or maybe is something for future research. So that would have probably been my take on the issue if COVID had hit us earlier in the writing process.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I do think, though, that there was a lot of stigma associated with COVID. And if I might, Frances, I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts as somebody in body studies and fat studies on the idea that, say, obesity predisposed somebody to this illness. And I know that that's a common thing in medicine, to say, oh, every problem you have is from because you're obese, rather than, whatever other factors are happening. And so on the one hand, presumably there was something they were getting at, but I also really wondered about that. And I wonder if you have thoughts about it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I actually, when we were writing this, I didn't have time to, I didn't have the kind of brain capacity to think about this at the time we were doing the final edits on this book, so I didn't add anything in. And also at the time, my chapter's about the climate change thing, but yeah, absolutely, the COVID obesity thing has been something that I've been thinking about, because yeah, it's this idea that you'll get it worse, or you're more likely to die, or more likely to need health care, or be in intensive care. And I was thinking about this earlier today, because I thought this question might come up, but about how I would, whether I think that a lot of the sort of ideas that are underpinning my analysis in my chapter actually probably work to analyse what's happened post-COVID as well. There's sort of, that continuing association of fat bodies with disease and death, and the kind of weakness and and that they are kind of over-consuming resources as well. So like kind of healthcare. Oh, as my internet.
You froze. Yeah, you froze.
Sorry, that's
but I think we got it.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot happening was there another part of your question that I've already forgotten that I can't remember?
No, that was it. Just your thoughts on.
I mean, I think that people, you know, there's been some really interesting discussions in sort of fact studies chat groups about whether, you know, because some people have been offered the vaccine earlier because of high BMI, and, you know, a lot of discussion about whether that's, you know, do you take that vaccine early because you, not necessarily because you are more at risk, but because you're more at risk from being poorly treated in the healthcare system because you're fat, or do you reject that idea because it's reinforcing that link that fat bodies? It's really interesting stuff, and I'm still kind of making sense of it.
That's fascinating. I would love to see an essay about that, because that is at the heart of the problems that you're addressing. That is really interesting. And of course, we saw a lot of racism, and not only in the US, but big time in the US, anti-Asian racism, people being attacked on the streets, things like that. So I'm wondering if any of the contributors, or I'm also going to invite the audience in, does anybody want to think through that? Is that something that one that you could imagine, for instance, for the contributors having brought more into your work, or maybe generating another project, or any thoughts? Because I think what Frances is getting at is how a crisis turning point really gets us to see problems. And by us, I don't necessarily mean academics, because we work on this stuff, but the mainstream, to see things that they don't ordinarily see. And I don't think the Black Lives Matter demonstrations were, I mean, I do put it positively. I think I know the Black Lives Matter demonstrations were linked to the pandemic. Anyone want to?
Yeah, I feel like it would be nice to also hear people from the audience. So
Yes.
If there's anyone, I was sort of waiting, but
and just giving people a second to find the unmute button. Although
Yeah.
I know it's perfectly okay if you don't feel comfortable jumping in with audio or video, you know, please feel free to put something in the chat. But yeah, we'd really welcome hearing your guys' perspectives as well. Because I know, looking at the list of people, I know a lot of you are also really working on these kinds of things yourselves.
Krista Collier-Jarvis, do you want to speak up, or is what you put in the chat what you wanted fully to say?
Yeah, that's just primarily it. There's a really good article that I've been reading, actually also in relation to like vaccine hesitancy and zombie narratives, on how, the links between racialized groups, similar to what Frances was saying, is because those systems are always already rooted in systemic racism, that there's a weighing of the risks between that and protection from viruses.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting which risk groups were then offered the vaccine, but which were not. You know, why was it not first in, say, in the US, in underserved populations? Why wasn't that the first place to send? And there are lots of reasons we'd be given that are infrastructural. Well, there weren't the clinics, there weren't the facilities, there weren't this and that. I wonder, right? Populations that were, in fact, more demonstrably likely to get the disease or die from it or be seriously ill from it were not the first groups targeted by the vaccine. And I have questions about that personally. Astrid and Frances, you've been having an interesting conversation in the chat. Do you want to bring it in?
Yeah, I responded just to what Frances said, that I found it striking that in the discourse, and I definitely agree with what Frances then responded, especially in the UK public discourse, obese people were blamed for being at a higher risk for catching COVID or having a severe illness resulting from a COVID infection than other people. So for instance, you could have blamed people with heart diseases that maybe their lifestyle is responsible for their heart condition, but that didn't happen. But with obesity, with being overweight, it happened a lot. So there's this kind of blame. This is a lifestyle choice, similar to, well, to make the connection to my research on gay people, that was also seen as a lifestyle choice, and AIDS as a result. So you have this framing of obesity as something different than other medical conditions. And I think with regard to what you said, Priscilla, just also the idea, I was thinking of the figure of the I don't have the word right really, the carrier of a disease who is themselves not afflicted. So what you mentioned, people who catch COVID but are not falling ill, but still they're contagious and can infect others. I think this also depends on how we see that person. It really depends on their identities. If it's a child, it's seen as something, okay, we have to deal with it. But if it's somebody who is seen as blamable in some way, because they didn't wear masks or whatever, then it's like we are really marginalizing and framing people maybe as kind of monsters in the most extreme case. So I think that also is something where we are coming back to other examples and other points of reference. Really, how we see things and phenomena really depends on with which type of person we associate them. Whether that's somebody who's marginalized, whether that's somebody whom we blame for being who they are, or for the living conditions they're in, or something. That is really something that struck me first with Francis and then now with your comment.
Yeah, great point. Francis, did you want to respond, or you've said what you, okay. Are there questions from the audience? I have more questions if there aren't, but I think this is a good moment to open up. If you raise your hand or just unmute if you can. Okay. Yeah, and one other thing that what you all were just talking about also made me think of is I was really intrigued to see smokers become people who were given, offered the vaccine earlier. And I understand from a public health point of view, the idea of who was offered the vaccine ahead of time obviously had everything to do with trying to keep people out of the hospital. So who was most likely to end up in the hospital? But I didn't hear any discussion, and I don't know if this was just a US thing. I think the smokers might have been, but I didn't hear any discussion from people about smoking being a life choice. So obesity, I heard that, and I heard it in some of the contexts that Astrid, you were talking about. Maybe it was happening, but nothing I read or nothing I heard, and I looked for it, raised the question of, but smoking's a life choice, whatever. So I did find that also really, really interesting. Okay, if there are no questions from the audience, I will throw out another one. From this experience, so, here's a, no need to come in on audio video. Okay, so Xavier Aldana Reyes asks, I've been wondering about the value of reconstruction rebuilding, especially because very few outbreak narratives, especially in the horror genre, seem optimistic. Why do you think this is? Any thoughts on that? Great question.
I can give my really quick thought, which is, that's because imagining the reconstruction and rebuilding is hard, right? Imagining something kind of better to replace the system that we have now is really tough. It's for some of the same reason why it's easier to imagine apocalyptic narratives than to imagine narratives that are post-capitalism, because it's tough to imagine a system that is truly post-capitalistic and truly equitable. And so I think that it is because it requires a much bigger kind of imaginative leap. But of course, I mean, you're bringing up, I think, a really good point, is that this kind of moment of crisis is, of course, also the moment when things can change. It's also the moment when people just get fed up. It's the moment when, I mean, I was reading earlier today about this big walkout at a Nebraska Burger King, where the employees who had been, just mishandled horribly by management, and partly because of COVID-related procedures that they had to follow, and COVID-related scheduling, they just like 8 or 9 of them just all got up and quit all at once. And that actually seems to be a kind of trend, at least in some countries, where people have reevaluated their lives and said, I don't need to take this kind of treatment from my employers. And so those are, I think, those moments of kind of potential that you get in a crisis where you do get that reimagining. And yes, I think you're right. That's absolutely important to start thinking in those kinds of terms. But the horror narratives, the outbreak narratives, aren't necessarily the best places to start for that.
Other thoughts on that?
Well, in traditional apocalyptic narratives, the apocalypse always leads to a millennium. So it's a very old template going back to the book of Revelation, and the whole notion that you have to destroy the old world to create a new one. And it's highly dangerous. I mean, blowing up things to create something new is not a good idea. The interesting thing about pestilence and pandemics is that they're different kinds. As I said, it's a different kind of apocalypse, but it's often in horror narratives. And the question is absolutely correct. In horror narratives, the pandemic is often appropriated or forced into this kind of traditional apocalyptic framework in which, let's destroy everything. There was a great article, I forgot who wrote it, about the nuclear war as urban renewal. So, you just destroy everything and then you build whatever is left on the ruins. But I think by now we realize it's not going to happen. The world has not come to an end. We're still here, we're still talking on Zoom. But it's an interesting thing to consider how those apocalyptic narratives impact our perception of what is happening now and the political implications, because there are political implications, but I believe they're different in different countries and in different contexts. So we're all here kind of Anglo-American. And I agree with you, Priscilla, what is happening in the US is very much, in the old modality of dehumanization and placing blame and finding, specific groups to blame. But I suspect in different contexts, it might have different political consequences. So I think we have to be careful about what and where and who we're talking about.
Definitely. And Megan, so I'm gonna just let everybody know, I see several interesting threads happening.
Yeah, I was gonna say, please feel free to jump on those first.
But I want to continue this one. And I'm going to go out of order on the comments, and we'll go to Megan and then Catherine Belling to keep talking about this. And then we'll come back to the vaccine question that I also see emerging, and the smoking question. So Megan, go ahead.
I was also just going to bounce around between some of these responses and thoughts, because this was originally what I found really interesting about what was happening with monsters in popular culture. So there's been a trend kind of in the 20th century where it's suddenly really cool to be a monster. Monsters are everywhere. We like to think, everyone is monstrous in some way, shape, or form. But then what we actually end up getting really often in popular culture is kind of these cis, white, able-bodied, conventionally attractive, whatever that means in the particular context, type of monster that really kind of, excludes all of these different perspectives. And I'm really interested to see how that sort of kind of develops after this pandemic, what happens with the monster after kind of the coronavirus pandemic. But to jump to what Ilana was saying, and also Savi's point in the chat about horror and narratives never seeming optimistic. So this is actually something I've been thinking a lot about. And Ilana will know this because we've been kind of talking about this in relation to a special issue on utopia, post-utopia in science fiction that Ilana is doing with the Humanities Journal elsewhere. And of course, anyone who works kind of in genre fiction knows there's a lot of crossover now, as always, between kind of horror and science fiction and fantasy, especially at this point, which, as Sarah was saying earlier, fiction is kind of being looked to as, if not activist itself, as a kind of pre-activist template for how to kind of do things differently or how to build differently after the apocalypse. And I get into fights about this a lot, about whether a particular text is or isn't optimistic, and what we mean when we define kind of optimism, and what we're looking for when we define utopia. Right, utopia for whom, utopia how, because it's always kind of this futurist vision. Whereas if we look at, and this has not, well, indirectly, it has a lot to do with my chapter. But if we look at, Black studies or Indigenous studies, there are lots of great examples of kind of post-apocalyptic narratives, because these are kind of cultures that have been demolished, multiple times and kind of rebuilt and produced kind of glorious, optimistic, again, depending on your definition of optimism, text. So I think what I'm really interested in is kind of taking a different lens to this and saying, okay, maybe this outlook is pessimistic to us, but is there a way that we could view these kinds of stories as optimistic for the ways that they represent solidarity and activism and kind of community building and all of these other things that are really necessary, but as Micah points out, really difficult to kind of grapple with. Sorry, that was sort of a long response.
No, I think that's great. I'm on the optimistic side also because they show everything being contained. And I think that's one of the reasons everybody wanted to read them now, is that there's almost all of them. The outbreak narrative, if it's an outbreak narrative, ends with a resolution. And when you're in the midst of a pandemic, there's something very reassuring about that. But I see Catherine Belling and Janice Deitner both have things to say about this, or Dietner, sorry if I mispronounced it. So why don't we do that and then maybe move on to some of the other threads that are coming up. So Catherine Belling, do you want to?
Okay, yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add. I was just thinking about, from a narrative perspective, obviously in the real world, we want containment, we want optimism and rebuilding, but I think the rebuilding is not only difficult, there's also a way in which it's kind of boring compared to the the disaster, the horror, the just at a in terms of attention. I've been thinking a lot about horror and attention, and what the sort of consoling part of horror is that it draws absolute attention in the present moment. Rebuilding means thinking about the future and doing this stuff in a context of uncertainty about whether or not it will work. And containment is always, I think, built on the potential of a future breach. And so the containment is always this both fascinating because it's not necessarily optimistic, but at the same time also, I'm not quite sure where the containment thing fits in with the rest, but I think part of it is thinking about, what is optimistic in the real world may not work from a narrative perspective. And I think that's why the outbreak narrative is so powerful, and the putting things back together narrative doesn't work in quite the same way. Which is why we go for the horror much more than the fixing, the cleaning up, right.
Great point. Janice, do you want to jump in? Yes, no? Okay. So let's go back to the vaccine question. Did you want to jump in on that? Do you want to jump in on that, Elena, since you raised it?
Oh, the vaccine is a really fascinating issue, how it was distributed, how it was created, and how it's received. And the fact that, you know, if you asked me a year ago, I would say people would be queuing in lines, you know, to get this vaccine. And yet we're confronted with vaccine hesitancy, which is a real issue in the US. And even here in the Bay Area, which is, you know, supposed to be whatever, there are people who refuse to accept the vaccine. And Astrid, what you said is absolutely correct. It has become a subject of conspiracy theories, often with anti-Semitic overtones, you know, microchips, come on, and the whole idea that it impacts your fertility, which is the oldest, you know, most like dangerous conspiracy theory, anti-Semitic racist meme, you know, going back to whatever, going back to the Black Death. So the whole, and so what is happening is the vaccine becomes, the cure becomes the disease itself. And it's purely an ideological reversal. There is nothing about, you know, in anything in medical discourse that could justify it. And it's really interesting how it brings back the oldest and the most damaging stereotypes and narrative forms, which again, going back to the Black Death, when, you know, when the Jews were blamed for poisoning the wells and spreading, and where often doctors as well were attacked for spreading the disease itself. So on the one hand, as the pandemic becomes a possibility of renewal, but it also brings back very old, you know, talking about zombies and vampires, those stereotypes have been buried and they keep coming back again and again. And so those people talk about zombie ideas, but it's more than that. It's zombie narratives, which are resurrected and repurposed for a particular ideological, you know, use, which is incredibly dangerous.
Astrid, did you want to jump in on that?
No, I think Elena said everything that I found striking about that. What she started with the vaccine as seen as sort of the cure, as seen as the disease or a new disease in itself, and then all these conspiracy theories, and that they hark back to all these ancient anti-Semitic stereotypes. I found that in particular striking, all these anti-Semitic, even if it was applied to Bill Gates, that everybody knows is not Jewish, but that didn't matter to conspiracy theories, as reason never does. So that would have been my only point, but Elena made it already much better.
I also want everybody to know that as of the news that today, the Tennessee state legislature has made it illegal to encourage teenagers to get vaccines of any kind. And they are not allowing places where teens have had one of the, you know, RNA vaccines to be notified that and reminded that they need to make an appointment for the second one. So this is a whole new world we're dealing with. I mean, it's one thing to be nervous about vaccines, but to make it in this anyway, and vaccines that used to be required, like measles. So here we are. There was, I'm sorry, I'm going back to a question a while ago from Kay Troyer about, so do you want to speak? Do you
Sure.
want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. Apologies for not being able to change my name. Zoom was unhappy with me today. My name is Katie Troyer, she, her, and I think what I find so interesting is that all of you were saying that you felt so impressed to write these chapters, this book right now at this time. And I'm just wondering, what's next? What do we need? And where should we be headed in terms of this sort of intersectional, interdisciplinary examination of contagion and horror?
Megan?
I mean, I think you really nail it when you say intersectional. And for real, you know, this is something that we definitely had in mind very strongly when we were writing the book. It's something that we really tried as much as possible to be when we were putting together the chapters and the contributors. But but is of course not as successful as we would have wanted due to various kind of institutional pressures, people having to drop out because of kind of various levels of marginalization, various levels of illness and capacity, and all of these things. So I think that's really one of the biggest things that I speak for myself, but I know a lot of the contributors are really invested in this and are kind of involved in various kind of policy or activist or artistic ways to try and figure out how we can make this happen. And I'm not sure to what extent that's possible within the institution, at least in the current climate in the UK at the moment. But yeah, how to make space for it not to be just us talking about this, but for a more intersectional, for a much wider set of voices to have a platform to discuss these kinds of things, and how to kind of bring these voices into the discussion in a way that doesn't put kind of unfair pressure on them to publish or perish.
Sarah.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question also because I sort of hinted earlier, I feel very much like, originally my sort of academic interest is presidents and their media. And then I was writing about the Ebola scare in the US. I was sort of trying to step away from presidents and their media, but actually the guy who was a key player in that kind of Twitter thing became president, and then there was, so I've constantly felt that all of this has been my fault to some extent. I'm actually behind on or I'm sort of inadvertently writing about, or moving towards what's kind of already happening, and so I think that like Megan is very right. I've felt strongly actually that we should think more about, but also give more of a voice to all kinds of grassroots movement. And I think particularly in the context of pandemics and climate change, I also think I'm increasingly noticing these sort of, as we've kind of already talked about, I guess, the sort of politics of hope, or the idea of hope becoming increasingly kind of politically divisive, and also kind of different politics of hopelessness, you might say. So this sort of idea that a terrible report about climate change comes up and no media report about it because it's kind of too terrible, and or they and also then at the same time a kind of discussion like, if we can't stop this from happening, how do we deal with it ethically still, or does that just kind of fall away? So.
And the whole rallying cry of we're all in this together, the hopeful, quote unquote, hopeful rallying cry, are we? Can you put actions to those words?
Exactly. It's kind of like, the years old joke of, thoughts and prayers. Something terrible has happened. Let's, and that becomes kind of, I think, increasingly obvious, right? That's not, we're not all in this together, or we're not all in the same situation.
Yeah, great points. Micah?
Yeah, well, just in the answer to where to go next, I mean, I've been lucky enough to springboard from this to work on some collaborations with the School of Public Health at my university. We're right now working on some media analysis that's then also going to lead to media training for media outlets in Armenia in terms of how they report on the COVID pandemic and future pandemics. And so, sort of taking some of the things that we do as, as cultural studies scholars in terms of analyzing, well, okay, here's where you're going wrong with these tropes, with these narratives that you keep falling back into. And then, actually trying to take it into a set of recommendations. Well, here's what you could be doing better. Here's how to actually report this right, or at least better. Kinds of sets of media framings to use, rather than some of the same old ones that keep causing all of this misinformation and divisiveness.
Yeah, great points. I have a million more questions, and I see a million more in the chat, but we are winding toward the end here. So I apologize to anyone whose question I missed. Those of you who've taught lecture classes, as I have, know it's really hard to go back and forth between the chat and the discussion, but maybe we could end with Keshav Bansal's question. And do you want to unmute or do you want me to read your question? And I apologize if I have, read, okay. I'm sorry if I mispronounced anyone's name. I found the denial and concealment of infection interesting. I look at it particularly in relation to purity, impurity in a sociocultural and religious sense. Somehow the infected became the exiled and condemned. So people went to great lengths to not get tested or to hide the infection from friends and family, especially in the countryside and rural neighborhoods. I would like to know what you guys think about this. And Elena, you've responded, so maybe Micah, is your hand still up, or why don't I go to Elena and then whoever else?
It's totally a great question, because the whole issue of purity and impurity is absolutely crucial to the idea of contagion, both, in medical science, but more importantly in a symbolic sense, and the way in which people with leprosy were isolated, literally exiled from communities. So, but I pointed out, and this is really interesting, that both the disease and the cure have been cast as impure by, different political groups. So I heard about people who refused to take the vaccine because somehow it was impure. It was a contamination of the body by foreign agent, whatever, microchips, what have you. So, and this is, again, I can't stress strongly enough how dangerous it is. The whole idea of purity and impurity is extremely dangerous. And I would actually like to hear more about how it works out in different contexts, from the Anglo-American. But I know, for example, in Israel, the religious, the ultra-Orthodox community was particularly prone to COVID. And it was absolutely cast in terms by the secular community. They saw the ultra-Orthodox as being impure because of the high incidence of COVID. And the ultra-Orthodox saw the secular community as being impure because of the lifestyle. And eventually, so the whole debate of purity and impurity became incredibly politicized in this particular context. So I'm sure it's happening all around the world. And I would love to know more about it.
Well, that was a great place to end. And I wanted to leave time to have the editors close us out. So unless there's, yeah, go ahead.
No, thank you so much for that, Priscilla. And thank you so much, Rosie. Yeah, just for taking the time both to contribute to the collection and review the collection, but also to be here today and lead us in a discussion that I've really enjoyed. And it was a great opportunity to kind of meet other people working on contagion fiction, and also to meet some of the people from the collection who I've spoken to over email, but have kind of never actually seen face-to-face in a Zoom call or in real life. So thank you everyone so much for being here. Thank you so much for your comments and questions in the chat. Please feel free to kind of email us with follow-up questions if you have those. We would love to hear them and continue this discussion elsewhere.